Hello and welcome to the Soft UK podcast. I'm Sonia Sankoli and I'm the Events and Communications Officer for the charity Soft UK, which is a support organisation for families with trisomy 13 and 18 or Patels and Edwards. This podcast today will be speaking and hearing from one of our Scottish families story ahead of our annual Scottish Family Day. So I'd like to welcome Demi Powell to the podcast. Welcome, Demi. Thank you very much for coming on for this one.
That's all right. It's nice to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you too. So we'll just start with a little intro of yourself, Demi, a bit about your story, about your son Connor, and what brought you and how you got brought on by Soft UK.
So I'm quite an old school member. I've been here for a long time.
Yes.
Yeah, my son would have been 22 this year.
Goodness.
He had full Edwards syndrome. We had a prenatal diagnosis, which was still quite unusual at that time. So yeah, people did have them, but it was much more of a kind of 50-50 situation 20 years ago. Sort of some people did have them, but a lot of people still didn't. Whereas I think they're better now at prenatal diagnosis. So I found out that he had Edwards syndrome at my 20-week scan because they spotted some stuff on the scan. I was only 23, and it wasn't a planned pregnancy. It was an unexpected pregnancy. Very welcome, but we hadn't been planning it. So I didn't really know anything about being pregnant. I was just winging it. And I think I had absolutely no idea that sometimes pregnancies didn't just result in a baby, because I just never thought about it, because I'd only found out I was pregnant at 15 weeks. So I was still getting used to the, oh my God, I'm 23 and I'm pregnant sort of idea. And then went for my scan thinking, oh, we'll ask if it's a boy or a girl. And then where I live in a really small town in rural Scotland where everybody knows everybody. So it was my friend's big sister who was doing my ultrasound, which is lovely when you're just asking if it's a boy or a girl. And not so great when they have to tell you that actually they can see something on the ultrasound that isn't great. And it was nice for me that it was somebody I knew, because somebody I've known.
Was she aware of it?
And yeah, I think she knew what she was looking at. Yeah. Obviously the ultrasound, I don't know if it's still the same now, but in those days the ultrasound technician couldn't tell you anything. All they could do is say, there's some things on the scan that I want the consultant to have a look at. And then they put you in a side room and give you a cup of tea and a box of tissues, which is kind of an indicator that all has not gone well. So it was nice for me that it was someone I knew, but I think pretty not a great day in the office for her, probably. Really tricky. And then the consultant came back and told me what he could see and told me what they were going to be testing for. And then I had the amnio right there in the ultrasound.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So there was a lot of stuff that happened 20 years ago that practice-wise wouldn't be the same now. So like, I had the amnio.
Was it like recommended to you to have the amnio, or was it your choice?
Well, they just said that's what was kind of happening. Yeah, that's what. And they also tried to book me in for a termination at the same appointment. So it was very much like, we think your baby's got Edwards. The next step's to do the test just to confirm, and then we'll do the termination. Sort of. Yeah. Which, and of course, I went along with the amnio, but by the time I'd got home and thought about it, I was like, wait a minute, do I have to have a termination? Because like. And then obviously started unpicking it and discovered that actually no, but it's just the assumption. So we had, that was all obviously really difficult because I was 23 and I hadn't had much experience of consultants or hospitals, or I'd had the odd medical procedure when I was younger, but not something so serious and first child. Yeah, but I was really lucky because we had a specialist midwife who worked at the high risk clinic. So I immediately got, you're now in the high risk clinic. And the midwife hadn't been there that day, but they got her to phone me And she said, I'm Mandy and I'm your specialist midwife. We don't come across this very often, but there is a charity that helps people when they have a diagnosis or a potential diagnosis of this condition. I've managed to find a phone number. Would you like the number? And they gave me the number, and it was Chris Rose's number, who is one of the founders of Soft UK.
Yeah.
And I was really, I'm not great at phoning people. I don't really like phoning. But in those days, you didn't have the internet, really. I mean, you kind of had emails and stuff, but you didn't have much internet stuff. Much wasn't online. So I did phone her. And I was really glad, because all that stuff about, right, you're booked in for your termination. She was like, oh no, wait a minute. Like, is that what you want? No, you've got a choice. Like, that doesn't have to, this is what you should be asking for. And of course the hospital had said, these babies absolutely cannot survive, and brought out some medical journal of like 1940 something, and she was like, oh, wait a minute, no, like, and gave me so much more information, so that I was kind of like, right, we need to put the brakes on here and just slow everything down, because they're like, well, you need to make a decision now, you're already almost 21 weeks, and she was like, no, you don't, like, back that bus up. And that was great, because it just gave me the time to actually find out, like, what is this condition, what is this about?
Absolutely, yeah.
What are my rights? What are the baby's rights? Because, like, obviously when you're pregnant, the baby has absolutely no rights at all as far as anybody else is concerned. But actually, once it is born, it does have rights, and we needed to work all that out. And I live in a really rural place. We don't have a big hospital. We don't have paediatric intensive care. Anybody that has really difficult births will go up the road to Glasgow. So we didn't have things. So if I was planning on not having the termination, we had a lot of medical things to make. Where was I going to have the baby? What was going to happen to the baby? That kind of stuff. And I honestly think if I hadn't found Soft while I was still pregnant, it would have all been totally different, because there was so much stuff during the pregnancy that I had to work out and find out about that I would have had no clue. Like,
so you weren't given were you given a lot of support or resources from the hospital that you were with, or the consultant?
So the specialist midwife was brilliant. She was really great. And she even came in when I was delivering in the end, even though she wasn't due to be on shift. And she was lovely. And she was really good at talking stuff through. And she was also really good at going back to the doctors and saying, look, I've spoken to her and she doesn't want this and she doesn't want that. And she knows, and going back to them and being like a kind of middle person. And then I had a big showdown, prompted by all the information that Chris and Rosemary, who was the professional advisor at the time, so she had lots of medical stuff. So they sent me a load of stuff, and I went back in and I said, I want a meeting with the obstetrician and the paediatrician. So we had this meeting, and I was like, right, put everything on the desk. And I said, you told me that these babies can't survive. Look at this child. Look at this child. Oh, no, that's not right. And I was like, So we had this big kind of showdown. I said, you need to go and update your knowledge. This is our medical advisor. She's happy to talk to you. There won't be a termination, because I decided that wasn't right for me. It's the right decision for some people, but it wasn't for me. And that's what's important. It's your pregnancy and you need to make your own decisions. And I said, we're not having a termination. I don't want to be offered it again unless there's some sort of serious risk to my own health or the baby's health. I don't want to be offered this. This is what we're doing. And we need to go from here forward as a team, right? And that's it. And then after that meeting, it was fine. So my consultant was really good. And when I had my youngest daughter, so I had 16 years between pregnancies, they asked me which consultant I wanted, because by this time I was old, so I was automatic high risk. And I asked if he was still there, and I had the same consultant for my daughter.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, so we did get on really well. The problem was that 20 years ago, the policies were the policies, and I was not going to get delivered in Glasgow. I was not. I think we managed to argue that we could have had the baby resuscitated, but they weren't going to put him in Skaboo. You know, it was just, it just wasn't going to happen.
That's so difficult. It must have been so. It sounds like you had barriers throughout the whole pregnancy, and you weren't able to focus on what you really needed to focus on, which was your baby.
Yeah, no, you couldn't at all. And I didn't keep well at all. I was really poorly, and it was just one thing after another. And we only had such a short time because I hadn't known I was pregnant early on. Like the whole majority of my pregnancy was once we already knew. So I was in and out of hospital. It was rotten. And pretty stressful. But the thing was, because I already was part of Soft by that point, I wasn't on my own. So there was other people who were pregnant. I joined so Karen Schuler in Australia, she runs Soft Australia. Well, she did at the time. And she had an online message board. Now, this just wasn't a thing back in those days. You know, it was like so rare. And she had this online message board from people all around the world. And there was people on there, and some of them had babies, some of them had lost their babies, and some of them were pregnant like me. Now, I'm still friends with those girls, 25 years later kind of thing. And that was all, it got you through it. You weren't on your own anymore. And then I was really lucky.
Did you meet many Scottish families back then?
Well, so when I was still pregnant, the English Family Day was taking place. And I must have been like 8 months, I think, pregnant. So I actually went to the English Family Day first, even though I was in Scotland, just because I was so desperate to meet people. So I went down to England first, and there was a wee girl called Annie Dudney, who had full Edward syndrome, and I think she was about 7 maybe at the time, quite big. And I went down there with my great big bump, and she was sitting on my knee, and we took a photo. I was good friends with her mum, Jane, and we took a photo, and I took that photo back to the paediatrician who had told me that it was physically impossible for these children to survive. And I think they still hadn't believed me, even when I'd shown them photos. They'd been like, "Oh, that's a really rare case," And I took all these photos, and Saskia was there, and a few other young people. And I think maybe even Chris's son was there in those days. And I took the photos back to the paediatrician and said, "There you go. There's me in a photo with a child with Edward syndrome." And it kind of blew them away. And then I met Liz, who was the Scottish rep at the time. And she told me about all the families in Scotland and stuff. I don't think I'd met any of them apart from Liz before I actually had my son. In the end up, he was stillborn at full term. I'd been due in for a planned section on the Tuesday, and on the Monday, I felt him stop moving. So I went in and they checked, and he'd gone. But in the end, what had happened was his umbilical cord had failed. So yeah, which is just bad luck and can happen with any pregnancy.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we also found out years later that I actually have a condition, an autoimmune condition, which can cause heart block and umbilical cord failure in pregnancy. And it happens to lots of people with my condition. So when I had my daughter 16 years later, my umbilical cord was measured the whole time to check that the blood flow was still going. And she ended up being an emergency section. So it might be that actually what caused the stillbirth wasn't his Edwards at all. It was my autoimmune condition. But in those days, I wasn't diagnosed. So it was just a total freak thing. And obviously I'd stayed in touch with Liz, and the Scottish Family Day was the September that year, and Chris used to come up for it as well. So I knew Chris. And they kind of supported me to come, because I lost him in the June and it was the September, and I was an absolute mess. I was not
Well, yeah,
not
and you were still 23. That's
yeah,
very young to
yeah, I
deal with
was
all these emotions.
not a pretty bereaved person at all. And Chris
Mm.
would tell you, we talk about this often because we're still friends now. And I was just like, I was so angry. Like I was just
Mm.
furious. I think because of the like, if I'd been treated properly, would it have changed stuff?
Mm.
And actually, now that I'm older, I think, well, how would I have coped with being in paediatric intensive care for 6 months? I don't know. Don't know. Things just work out the way they work out. But at the time, I was furious, like
Mm.
really angry, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. Like I was a mum, and I had no baby. Like
Yeah, yeah,
you know how that is. You're just
yeah.
I'm a mum. What?
It's just
Where's your
heartbreaking,
baby?
isn't it? Because
Where's your
no one
child?
knows
Like,
about it.
no,
I
no.
think the more difficult it is when you meet new people that
Yeah.
have
Have you
met
got
you
any
after.
kids?
Yeah. And it's avoiding those questions, or you don't know how you're going to feel on the day, whether you want to share everything or not anything at all. And, it's such a because they don't know you're a completely different changed person.
Yeah.
I can definitely say that's
Yeah.
me now. I can't even remember who I was before
No.
my son now. And I wouldn't want to know who that person was anymore because it wasn't the real me. I always say to myself, but it's those questions that you don't know how to answer and stuff. And
Mm.
you were doing it at 23. That's,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
difficult.
And then if you overshare, then you can see that the person's pure horrified.
Yeah.
Because usually the people that were asking me were young as well. It's not like now
Yeah.
when we've all got a bit more understanding of the
Mm,
world. Up
exactly.
until the point I had my son, I was still out clubbing. Do you know what I mean? You're like, oh, what
Mm,
did I just go back out clubbing this weekend? Like,
yeah.
what?
Yeah.
Like, no, I
Go
should be
back
at
to
home with my
another
baby.
world.
No, I can't be at home with my baby.
Yeah.
Because he's not there. And
Mm.
yeah, it was just and
Which is why I
everything else.
found it so more helpful to speak to families from SOF, because
Yeah,
you wouldn't need to hide anything. You wouldn't need to,
yeah,
you could talk about anything because they're going through exactly the same
yeah,
thing or have done themselves. So it's easier to bond with them, isn't
yeah.
it?
And just being able, I think, to talk about your child, like not
Yeah.
even just about how you're feeling, but be able to say things about your baby and without everybody pulling a face. Because my friends were great. I've had the same friends since we were at primary school, and they were
Mm,
great. They really tried, but none of them had kids, and none of
mm,
them had well, not many of them had a big bereavement, and they
yeah.
all try, like they all came down from uni for the funerals and stuff, and they hung about and they came to visit and they like coped with me showing them pictures of my baby that had passed away, which must be horrific when it's not your own baby. And then, of course, I
Yeah.
realised that it wasn't really appropriate to show my photos to people, but it is in soft because we've all seen pictures of each other's babies. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. We're,
But
we're
people in
curious more than anything as well to
yeah,
see if there are any similarities with our babies, because
yeah, yeah.
we see our babies as our babies, but we never necessarily see the features and everything that comes associated with the condition
Mm.
first, only until you see other pictures and you
Yeah,
think,
yeah. You're like,
oh,
oh, they're so
my
alike.
baby had that. And that's right. Yeah. So it is different. It
Well,
is
we
different. But I think that's what makes your community much more tight knit and
yeah,
special.
it's very rare to well, it's not so rare now, but it was very rare at the time to have male survivors with Edward syndrome. Nearly all
Mm,
the ones we had were girls. So I never, because a lot of people, when they talk about coming to family days, are like, I don't know how I'll cope with seeing a child if they look like my child. And I never had
mm,
to do that because they were all girls. So it was fine.
mm.
And then I think I must have been going to the family day for about 6 or 7 years. And we had a lovely wee boy in Scotland called Adam. And my son's middle name was Adam. And I'd never met them before. And she wheeled her son in to the family day. I was like, oh my God, like
Yeah.
he's so like my son. And I was like,
How old was he?
he was at the time, I think he was about 7, maybe. So he was obviously a
Mm,
lot bigger, but just the eyes and the hair. And it's like, oh my God. And then I was like,
Yeah.
is that what my son would have looked like if he'd survived?
Yeah.
And I
You
thought, oh,
do think that.
now I know how everybody else feels. Because with the girls, there's so many girls that like you
Yes.
always go to family day and there will always be a surviving child there who's a girl. And there are not all the girls, but there are similarities between a lot of them. And I think it must be quite hard. And I've had families say that to me over the years that I've been supporting. We thought about coming to the family day and we couldn't because we thought it might be too hard. And that was the first time it had happened to me. And I was like, so of course I went over and introduced myself and made friends with them. Because it's the only thing you can do, isn't it? You're like, if I don't meet this head on, I'm not going to
That's
cope with
right.
this at all. And yeah,
well, you've been with Soft for so many years now. How have you seen the families that have come through evolved, or the challenges that you had? Have you seen some of that? Like, are you seeing that families still sort of talk about those sort of
what
barriers?
I think
and
was really upsetting for me. So a couple of years ago, when I was working for Soft for a little while, we did the NIPT training programs in England and Wales. So we were training professionals how to talk to families when they receive a potential diagnosis or they're going for further testing for Edwards and Patterns. And it was amazing because we've been trying to get in to teach the NHS for as long as, before I was even involved with Soft, probably since it started. And we finally had our foot in the door and it was fantastic. And I was really lucky to do some of the road shows up in Scotland with some of our families. And we'd been adamant from the start, we're taking the kids. Because I know there are still doctors out there who will say, oh, well, they don't survive, And I said, we're taking the kids. Because you can't, if the child is there, you can't deny that's a surviving child. So we took the kids. And it was really challenging because we had so many, it was brilliant and the kids were great, but we had so many doctors say to us, I didn't know this was possible. And at that point, so this will be before COVID, so we're talking about 15 years on from when I lost my son, and we still had heads of neonatal units saying to us, I didn't know this was possible. And when you think of the implication of that on families that are experiencing pregnancy now, are they still being met with the same information that I was met with 20 years ago? And that I think it's sad that so much has come on in medical care. So quite a lot of our children are now getting medical care, not as many of them as any of us would like, but they are receiving medical care. There's so many advancements now. They can be fed, their breathing can be assisted. There's more advancements in physio and communication devices, that make their quality of life so much better and make, less of the medical issues for the kids. But yet we're still not being honest during pregnancy and letting families know that actually this is the reality and this is what the situation is. And
well, a big part of Soft now is changing that perception with the professional community. I think we've always had that gap to fill, and the only way we can do it is reaching out to them, whether it's like individually or as an association, and keep that message going that we are the charity that families like this can turn to and we can change their
I think it was a huge result to get our stuff into their literature.
Absolutely.
Because at least now every family knows about us. Whether or not they pick up the phone is their choice, but at least now every family knows that we're there. Which 20 years ago absolutely didn't happen. It was just potluck that I had a midwife who knew. And then we had another case in the hospital. We ended up both being pregnant at the same time. So she was like 6 weeks less far on than me. She had her baby in the August. And she was like, this has like never happened before. We've had 2 pregnancies at the same time. With the same
really?
Because we're at a small hospital. And again, the midwife was like, do you 2 want to go for a coffee? And we were like, yes. So we were really, really lucky, I suppose, from that point of view, because then we had each other. So we were
Yes,
in, I mean,
exactly.
I only met her maybe about 6 weeks before I lost my son. And then in a way that was tricky because my baby was already gone. And then she was like, oh God, is that going to happen to me too? You know, but we did have each other, and we, you know, we could
Yeah.
physically go for a coffee or like phone
Yeah.
each other or,
I feel like the families in Scotland, you know, they are so tight knit. However, they all do live quite far from each other. It's not possible to do that. So that's why the Scottish Family Day especially means so much to them,
yeah,
because it is the one time they can get together and catch up, and not necessarily to share, you know, their past experiences, just to
yeah.
move forward and see what people have been doing in their own lives going on, and building those, you know, that relationship and keep it going.
Yeah, I think the Scottish soft has got. I think a lot of it, you know, is down to Liz over the years, and then I think
Mm.
before her, Duncan and Fiona, because she's just kept in touch with everyone. So,
Yeah.
I mean, my other kids. So I've got 3 other kids now, 2 boys, who have special needs. They're adopted, and then I had a little surprise, a little surprise girl, who just turned 7. Um, and my kids have grown up in soft. You know,
Yeah.
I adopted my oldest son about 4 or 5 years after I'd lost Connor, and he's been coming to soft since he was 2. He's 18 now,
Yeah.
um, and there's just something about
There's something about.
the Scottish families, the Scottish group, the way that they've sort of created that group and facilitated it and kept it all together. It's great. Nobody ever seems to leave. So even though I lost my son 20 years ago, I wouldn't miss it. And
No.
everybody is together. So there's families with surviving children. There's families who had children who survived a really long time, and then they lost them maybe in early adulthood, etc. There's families who chose to end their own pregnancy. There's families who miscarried. There's families who had stillbirths like me. There's families who had babies that were lost in the first year. We've got loads of surviving children, which is brilliant because it just lights everybody up. But we've always all been together. There was never,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a numbers thing because we're small in number, but we've always all been together. But there was never any kind of like, oh, all the bereaved people are this way and all the non-bereaved people are that
Yeah.
way. You know, we're just like a big family. And
Yeah.
Liz always kept in touch with people. So there's times in your life when you might drift off for a bit if you've got really busy family life, or if you're working too hard, or if you're just not in a great place and you're like, I can't deal with that kind of stuff at the moment. And then you drift off for a bit. But I think because she keeps in touch, everybody always comes back. So you might not be there every year.
Yeah.
And of course, the thing like now with social media and stuff is that we are all in touch in between. So it might just be a comment or happy birthday to someone, or, you know,
Yeah.
somebody sharing one of their child's achievements, something that they've done, and we all comment, or just dropping somebody a message if you haven't heard from them from a while. And so we might not see them for 2 or 3 years, especially over COVID. That was absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
Um,
Very, very challenging.
but you still, you know, it still wouldn't, if I needed them for something, or if I wanted to offer a bit of support, I wouldn't think twice about dropping them a message or a call
Yeah.
or something.
That's right.
Because I don't know, we just all feel like we know each other so well, and the kids have all grown up
Yeah.
together, and they only
And
see
it's
each
lovely.
other
I think
once
you
a
summed it
year.
up well. I think it is the personal touch that's
Yeah,
kept it going from Liz, um and because of that, all the members are happy to sort of stay in touch
yeah.
and continue being like a big Scottish family. So it's
And I
nice
think
for,
what's
you
nice
know,
about it is as well, which is it can be a real danger when you've got a small group, is it's not at all cliquey. So new people come and they're just sucked into it all, and
yeah.
they just become part of it. And then with, you know, the next time they're just part of it. And I think, because I think that's always other charities I've worked for or groups that I've run locally, it is always a bit of a danger when you create a really close knit group that they're cliquey.
Yeah.
And it's not a bad thing. It's just people get comfortable with who
Yeah,
they
yeah.
know, and then it becomes too much of an effort. And it's just never been like that. I think I think Liz and Laura now as well do a lot of groundwork with people. So if there's new people coming, some of us will know that there's a new person coming and know, you know, enough to go and
Give
speak to
them
them.
a bit more time and stuff, and
Yeah,
welcome them in much more.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to. I think that's a great way of sort of holding these family days as well, for people to know that they can be part of this sort of community, and they sort of are, whether they can be as involved in it as much as they want, come and
yeah.
go, it'll still
Exactly.
be
And you can
there.
come and go and it'll still be there in the background. Because we've had periods, like I went abroad for a while. And then when the kids were little, sometimes like the boys were in and out of hospital quite a bit, and it was a bit tricky sometimes to get there. And obviously the people with surviving children quite often have that, you know, the night before one of them gets the flu, or, you know, they can't make it. But then
Yeah,
of course now with like Zoom and stuff, you know, some of them, like Libby last year, zoomed in and stuff. So
yeah,
um
exactly. Yeah, there's ways
they
of
could still take
keeping involved.
part.
Yeah, ways of keeping people involved. Well, I think that's a lovely way to probably round off the podcast. Otherwise, we'll be
Chatting all
we could
day.
gush about it for hours, couldn't we? But if there's anyone listening, then we'll the next Scottish Family Day is going to be on the 16th of September. There's still spaces available, so you're more than welcome to come and join this special, unique family, as Demi's described it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Demi, and
That's quite all
sharing
right. It's lovely to speak to you.
story and your insight into what it's been like being Soft UK. And it's great to hear from someone who's been with Soft UK for so many years, and it's a great credit to know that people can still stick around with the charity for as long as they want to, or however long they need to. So yeah, thank you for that. And I'll just finish off by saying, if you're an expectant parent, a bereaved parent, family member, or professional, you need support or information from Soft, we're always here for you. Reach out to the Soft team. Contact details are on the website, and can also be found in the podcast blurb that will be posted with this. Thanks again, Demi, for your time, and we look forward to the next podcast.
Thank you.